trickle in. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to have the folks from the Diversity Lab here to talk with us about all things related to legal and diversity, equity, inclusion, and whatever other things I'm missing on that. So thank you all. I know that these folks want to have an interactive discussion. So I will say, if you have questions, feel free to jump in. But I'm actually going to kick it over and let Layla and Valerie do their own intro, and welcome, and thank you very much for being here. And if Layla, Valerie, I don't know who's going first, but take it away.
Thanks, Nikki. Thank you so much for having us. And I will say thank you to Diana. I see you on for introducing us to this group. We're really excited to be here. Diana has been a part of our legal department work really since its inception with the first iteration of the Mansfield Rural Legal Departments, which we'll talk a little bit for legal departments, which we'll talk a little bit about today. But my name is Layla Hawk. I have been at Diversity Lab for just over 4 years. My role now is as Chief Growth Officer, and I have traditionally really focused on working with legal departments. And in my first 3 years, worked to stand up a program really that we could offer to legal departments. We've been working with law firms for 8 or 9 years now, and we've sort of partnered with legal departments in informal ways through that work. But we realize we really need legal departments to be a part of the solution. You're a big part of the legal profession, and it's been really fun working with legal departments over these past 4 years. Valerie?
Hi, everyone. My name is Valerie Portillo. I'm the legal department and law firm integration strategist at Diversity Lab. I do a lot of work with legal departments, so I am a direct beneficiary of Layla's work the past few years. In addition to working with legal departments generally, I also run the Diversity Dividends Collective, which is something that we will talk about in a bit, but generally it's an initiative that allows legal departments to track demographic representation with respect to their outside counsel teams. With that, we will, just to give you a quick overview of what we'll talk about today, we'll give you a brief overview of Diversity Lab as an organization, talk about legal operations professionals and how they can be, how we can leverage your skills and expertise when it comes to DEI. And also talk about effective firm management using diversity dividends as an example of something that legal departments can do. So just to get us started, Diversity Lab, if you haven't heard of us or worked with us before, is precisely that, a lab where we experiment with different ways of updating traditional organizational processes with the goal of creating sustainable practices that ultimately lead to a more diverse and inclusive legal profession. So we're not consultants or trainers. We really, as Layla liked to say, get in your business and really try to work with you to figure out how we can update processes to make sure DEI is a part of the conversation in a sustainable way moving forward. We work with law firms across the country and legal departments in various industries. And we use a design thinking approach to tackle pain points along the attorney pipeline, including recruiting, hiring, professional development, and advancement. And with that, I will kick it over to Layla.
Thanks, Valerie. So since we focus on real organizational and systems change, as Valerie said, and we don't do one-off trainings or engagements, legal operations professionals really become super important to our work. We know most legal operations professionals have data expertise, process management skills, are well-versed in technology and sort of efficiencies, and that becomes really important to ensuring the success of our program's Diversity Lab, but also more broadly with DEI initiatives in the legal industry. That's because we know it's very difficult to debias brains, but it is quite possible to debias systems using behavioral science and data. And so everything that we design and experiment with at Diversity Lab is grounded in those two things, behavioral science and data. We're always collecting data to make sure we can measure the effectiveness of our programs, and we are using data to create effective programs. So because of this focus on systems, efficiency, processes, and data, we really do work closely with legal operations professionals in our two key initiatives for legal departments. I already mentioned the Mansfield Rule for Legal Departments, which we've been partnering with Diana and I believe some others on the phone. At least I see familiar names and organizations at first glance. Mansfield Rule for Legal Department, we began in 2019. It is modeled off of the Mansfield Rule for Law Firms, which started in 2017. We started it for legal departments because we had a lot of legal departments who were sort of working with outside counsel, managing their outside counsel and pushing them to do more in the DEI space, say, hey, we really see this as working for law firms. And we want to make sure that we're not just asking our law firms to do this work, but that we are walking the walk as well. So what do you have for us? And in typical Diversity Lab spirit, we said, wait 1 second and let us get back to you. And we adapted the principles of the Mansfield Rule for Law Firms to work for legal departments. Just at a high level, the Mansfield Rule for Legal Departments requires in-house legal departments, I feel like I'll say that a million times today, to track and document the makeup of their candidate pools when they are hiring for positions within the organization and when hiring for outside counsel. So we work a lot with legal operations professionals in that space to help with the outside counsel requirements, of course, because those are baked into the Mansfield Rule for Legal Departments. But also, we know a lot of legal operations professionals really partner with their legal department leadership, or they run the show for MRLD, is what we affectionately call the Mansfield Rule for Legal Departments. Often they're partnering with HR to make tracking and documenting the makeup of candidate pools more efficient, yet still meaningful. And I think this is one of the things we're always trying to balance with all of our systems changes, is making sure that the implementation has some sort of efficiency baked into it, right? Because if it's too hard, people won't do it. Like I said, it's easy to debias systems, but not brains. So if we can debias the way that people sort of move through their processes, then we have success. But one thing that we always want to make sure of is that it's almost not too automatic or too efficient. If tracking and documenting is too automatic when it comes specifically to the Mansfield Rule for Legal Departments, we'll talk a little bit about that with regards to outside counsel. But then it doesn't serve the purpose of really slowing down the hiring process and keeping DEI top of mind. The big secret about the Mansfield Rule for legal departments and the Mansfield Rule for law firms, just the Mansfield Rule generally, I should say, is that we are really trying to get teams to hire more slowly. Because we know, again, I'll say it again, you cannot get rid of bias, but you can interrupt it. And that takes really slowing down. But then again, like I said, if it's too difficult, then people won't do it. So we're always trying to balance efficiencies with actually making sure that we're making meaningful change in people's actions and ultimately how they think. When you change actions, there's neuroscience that shows that it changes your brain as well. And then, of course, we work a lot with legal operations professionals about outside counsel management, which I know this is, I believe, the External Resources Management Group. I'm not sure if I got that title precisely right, but in that realm. And so I'm sure this is what you're what you're here for, is how to sort of manage outside counsel, particularly with regards to DEI. And as I said, my work for the first real 3 years of Diversity Lab was standing up our legal department programming and relationships. And that really involved me talking to often 5 to 10 legal departments a day who would just reach out to us and say, hey, we're trying to do this, or we want to do something, we don't know what on the diversity space, I would often joke, people would call and say, well, we want to do diversity and we're not sure exactly what that looks like. And I say, well, I don't know what that looks like either. So let's really talk about what you want to do here. And far and away, what legal departments wanted to focus on was leaning on their outside counsel to give them more diverse outside counsel teams. And because law firms are just such a behemoth when it comes to employer within the legal industry, they really wanted to get their law firms to do better, not just in who's working on their matters, but also, how their leadership is changing and diversifying their overall equity partnership and lawyers at the firm more broadly. And one thing that kept on coming up over and over, and it's still coming up today, I know all the time, is e-billing systems. So how to use them to boost DEI and outside counsel teams. And this is where sort of that balancing of efficiencies and automation with actually changing behavior becomes really important. So when we talk with outside counsel about, or I'm sorry, yes, with in-house counsel about managing outside counsel teams, we get a few questions. One is where to start? How do we collect the data? And second is, okay, well, we have the data, what do we do with it? It's hard to analyze, it's hard to really kind of see the trends and the patterns. And even if we can do that, we actually don't know what our goals are. What should we be driving in terms of metrics for our outside counsel teams? And on the data collection piece, that's really where the e-billing systems has come up, right? We have these new fancy softwares that allow law firms to input data for each timekeeper often. And wouldn't that be nice if you can just incorporate diversity metrics into those systems? And we have really thought long and hard about how to do this in an efficient way. And because we're in this sort of interesting space in the legal profession where we talk to a lot of legal departments and we talk to a lot of firms, we're really trying to balance the needs and the desires and the frustrations across all parties in the legal industry. So obviously the pros when it comes that come up when you talk about sort of using e-billing systems to track timekeeper diversity, timekeeper level diversity, is that in-house counsel can review the demographic information on timekeepers from law firms, often in real time. So they're getting those bills from their firms, or their firms are inputting their hours into the system, and you can quickly see, all right, what's the diversity or the representation of lawyers working on our matters at the billable hour level. And that data often can reveal how work was assigned, and it allows monitoring of outside counsel teams and staffing, which is really important when we talk about leadership and developing the next generation of leaders at law firms. And it's automated, right? It's a report-driven process. So it really kind of reduces the friction in this whole system. It doesn't seem too hard, so people will still do it. Although on the flip side, some of the cons is that it's actually quite difficult for firms. And we've seen really, I would say in the past year and a half, possibly because of a heightened attention to diversity in the world and racial injustices. And then that translates to organizations baking diversity and inclusion into their missions if they weren't already there, and then legal departments really thinking about how they partner with their firms and who they partner with. This heightened attention is really overloading the legal industry. And this has been something that we've been working on at Diversity Lab for quite some time. It's been a problem for decades, and it's really, I feel like just in all of our conversations we're having, it's at a tipping point. When law firms are required to provide timekeeper-specific demographic information, it's a real burden. First off, there's privacy concerns. They want to know where that data is being stored, who has access to it, what it's going to be used for. And many internal firm policies require consent from each individual lawyer before sharing demographic information with a client for every request. So not just a blanket, can we share this with clients, but their policies allow lawyers to opt in at every share, right? Yes, you can share it now. No, you can't share it now. And that's because people's minds change, right? And circumstances change. So this is a real burden on law firms in terms of resources, particularly resources that are dedicated to DEI and that we think could be used for better purposes. Another con to just looking at sort of hours and e-billing is, and we've looked at partnering with a lot of other organizations in really identifying how an easy way to spot quality work. How do we know whether 1 hour billed by a lawyer is actually good for their career, given their level? And the problem is lawyers use, I think there's like 500 or 600, you guys probably know better than me, it's UTBMS or UTMBS, I always get the acronym wrong, billing codes. And lawyers use like 25 of them for the most part. That's because they always want to use the words that, or the billing codes that involve the word strategy or strategic thinking. And so we don't really understand from billing codes what lawyers are working on. And we also don't understand whether or not the work is commensurate with their level at the firm. So if I'm a 5th year, quality work is going to look a lot different for me than if I'm a 1st year based on my career. Another sort of downside to just sort of baking it into these e-billing systems is that that means that at the firm level, these requests are often handled by accounting teams, if it's strictly related to billing, or marketing, or people whose sole job is to complete their DEI surveys at firms. And there are, at most firms, multiple people whose sole job is to complete surveys. What that means is we're not penetrating down to the lawyer level. We're not talking to the partners who are the owners and leaders of the law firms. And we're not engaging them in this process to keep it top of mind and really start to shift the legal profession to thinking about this and understanding the real complexity and nuance of the issues, besides just hours billed, numbers of lawyers on matters. When it is sort of just input into a system, it's often seen as sort of administrative work or diversity professional problem, not my problem, I'm a partner, right? So we really want to try to penetrate there and get to the partnership level. And sometimes that too much automation can hinder that. And then finally, well, no, I already mentioned that point, so we can move past that. Those are sort of the pros and cons of the e-billing strategy and automating sort of diversity metrics into what you're collecting from law firms. We'll talk about sort of our alternative and our best practices approach, but I'm curious if you have any questions or thoughts for an interesting conversation around this. As Nikki said, we'd prefer not to just talk at you, but talk with you.
I unvideoed myself when I meant to unmute. I actually had a question about something you said really early on. Can you, and you said a lot, so I'm sure others have thoughts. Can you talk just a little bit more about what you mean in slowing down the hiring process? Because that is something I had not heard before.
Yes, absolutely. And I will just fully admit I'm stealing this from another one of our early Mansfield Rule Legal Department Edition participants, Mega Perek. She is the CLO of the Jacksonville Jaguars and actually their umbrella corporation. But she, in a session explaining their involvement in the Mansfield Rule and how it's really changed their practices and affected their organization, she used this phrase, what it requires me to do, what the Mansfield Rule requires me to do is to fight to hire slow. When we hire quickly or when we do anything quickly, that's when our biases really come up because we're in automatic mode. And so I can really get into the nerdy conversation about the behavioral science. But if you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, right? He talks about sort of the two systems of thinking, system 1 and system 2. And I can never remember off the top. I think system 1 is the automatic one. Let's just say that for these purposes. And that is where bias comes in. So when we're not being intentional throughout our day, we're doing these automatic processes, or when we're in high stress environments and high time crunch environments, we have to make quick decisions. That is where bias comes in. That's where we make poor decisions, be they about DEI or otherwise, right? Whenever you're making a quick decision, you're sort of shortcutting, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but it's those circumstances where bias really arises. So what we know is we cannot train our brains not to make bad decisions when it comes to system one thinking. What we can do, though, is create processes that trigger us to move from system one to system two, to where we're slowing down and being really thoughtful. So for example, hiring quickly looks like, well, all of the lawyers on our team are from top 14 law schools. They all worked at top law firms, and they all were on law review. Okay, so that's what the job description is going to require. Okay, what we know is that traditionally top law schools have been way less diverse than some other law schools. We also know from data that law review is not at all a predictor of how a lawyer actually performs in their career. And what it takes to really hire correctly and hire the right person and open the door for more diverse applicants to apply and hopefully get selected is to slow down and think about really, what do we need? Do we care if they were at a top law firm, or maybe if they were at a smaller law firm where they got more on the ground experience, that would actually be more beneficial for our team. But that's not how we've always hired. So it does take slowing down. A little rambly. Was that helpful? Did that answer the question?
That was a great answer. Thank you. Yeah.
So that's really like with everything we're doing, we're trying to shift from system one, automatic thinking, which is where bias comes in, to system two, slowing down. And so that's why I was talking about sort of the balance and efficiencies versus actually changing behavior. But when we slow down and we shift into our system two thinking, we see, oh, hey, wait, data shows that law review doesn't mean anything. Data also shows that what law school you went to does not correlate to how you perform as a lawyer. What the data shows is if you speak a second language, or if you had a service job when you were growing up or before becoming a lawyer, you're more likely to be a high performer as a lawyer. But that takes time. Any other questions? All right, Valerie, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, sounds good. And so to build on what Layla said, when it comes to slow hire, we took that concept and translated it to what it means to engage new law firms. Both Layla and I were practicing in-house before we came to Diversity Lab, and there were always those law firms that an issue comes up, you know who to call, you call them, and that's it. And there's no necessarily consideration for who else might be out there that might help you solve the same problem. So we know there's obviously no silver bullet for sort of taking care of that issue and the others that Layla brought up when it comes to e-billing and tracking outside counsel. But we did want to come up with a program that we hope balances the needs of legal departments and legal ops professionals with the drawbacks of e-billing integration and timekeeper level data, all while driving more resources towards creating a more inclusive industry and moving resources away from continuing to define the problem that we know already exists. So big lofty goals, but that's how we work at Diversity Lab. So Diversity Dividends Collective is a pilot project that just launched last summer that makes the collection of outside counsel diversity data more effective and efficient for legal departments. And it also provides the basis for meaningful partnerships with outside counsel to boost DEI within those law firms. So just to give you some numbers around the collective, we have 30 legal departments that have joined in this pilot period. And as a result, over 270 law firms are participating in diversity dividends as a result, which is an incredible number. And in its in this pilot period, 90% of AmLaw 50 firms have received client requests in connection with diversity dividends, 81% of AmLaw 100 firms, and 59% of the AmLaw 200 firms have received client requests. So this is touching a lot of big firms that really need to think about their approach to DEI if they weren't doing so already, because they know that their clients are asking them to do it because they internally think it's important. So it's an alignment of values here. And the number of firms that are now participating shows that the collective idea is working. We know that there are a lot of legal departments that have individually taken the step to make their DEI commitments known to their law firms. But when you get 30 legal departments together, you're affecting a lot of law firms across the board. And this means that law firms that are participating now will be familiar with the survey next year and will know what to expect. The 5 metrics that we measure in the diversity dividend survey, which I'll get into in a bit, will generally stay the same. So this is a way for law firms to be able to hopefully direct less resources towards filling out surveys and more resources towards actually boosting DEI within their firms and as a legal industry as a whole. So top goals when we thought about diversity dividends were, 1, streamlining and standardizing data collection so that there's more time to form those strategic partnerships, both between legal departments and law firms and between legal ops professionals and their in-house lawyers. We know that, given that Diversity Lab facilitates the analysis and the collection of all this data, legal ops professionals can really spend more time partnering and thinking strategically with their in-house lawyers about how to manage outside counsel to drive DEI. Second, we wanted to start legal departments on reaching out with their law firms and starting those substantive conversations. We include, as part of the Diversity Dividends Collective, we created a toolkit that legal departments can leverage for use of communications and keeping their team on track in terms of timing. And also within that toolkit, we included draft billing guidelines to make clear from the start of an engagement what the legal department expects from their firms in terms of staffing and dedication to DEI. And finally, and most importantly, we're hoping that through this initiative, we can start to close the power and economic gaps within law firms by focusing on the metrics that really matter to a law firm's career. Not just data for data's sake, but useful, actionable information. So our 5-question survey asks for aggregate information, not timekeeper level information. And to go back to what Layla said, this really helps with privacy and consent concerns and hopefully encourages participation from firms when they know that they're being asked for aggregate level information rather than individual timekeeper information. And the survey questions themselves really focus on information that require the relationship partner or matter lead involvement. So this is not info that we know can be generated by a report. It really takes some human oversight. So to give just to paraphrase some of the survey questions, at a baseline level, we want to understand what is the overall demographic makeup of the lawyers working on the legal department matters at the associate, counsel, income partner, and equity partner levels. So we want to span the gamut. Second, we want to know who has consistent and direct interaction with the in-house team. And this is where that human element is really important. This is not a report-driven response. We want to know who is getting financial credit for the work, who leads the relationship and matters for the legal department, and who is getting credit for that relationship. And finally, we want to understand what is the law firm's attitude towards inclusion, or creating an environment of inclusion. And for that, we ask law firms to fill out the inclusion blueprint, which is an assessment that Diversity Lab developed. Their responses are then scored, and that score is passed on to the legal departments. So we obviously there's a lot of really good data that we'll be getting out of these surveys, and we know it's important and it's helpful, but I will emphasize this again and again. It's really not the end goal. It's the starting point. So with Diversity Lab taking on the administrative task of managing the data piece, we hope that legal department leaders, and which includes legal ops professionals, can really spend their time having conversations with their law firm partners, relationship partners, matter leads, about partnering on DEI related efforts. I know that was a lot of information on the Diversity Dividends Collective, so happy to pause there and see if anybody has any questions. Oh, I see. Well, I see there's one in the chat as to whether we're accepting legal departments in the program. So our registration is currently closed since we just rolled out surveys to collect 2021 data, but we are aiming to open registration to collect 2022 data at the end of Q1 or beginning of Q2 of this year. So if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to me, and we'll put you on the list to give you any updates. Any other questions?
It's a quiet group.
If not, I will kick it back to Layla to sort of wrap things up.
Yes. Oh, 1 second. I've lost my Zoom. There we are. So one thing we know, we don't know what's worked and what hasn't. This, as Valerie mentioned, this is really the pilot year. We're in the process of collecting survey responses. We are doing all the communicating with law firms. And so we're hearing on the ground information. And as Valerie mentioned at the very beginning, we are, we take seriously the concept of design thinking, and we incorporate it into everything we do. So every year we iterate. As Diana knows, the Mansfield rule now looks quite different than it did in its first year, and that will continue to be the case. That makes sure that we're addressing concerns and actually, putting out programs that work for people implementing them, but also that we're continuing to push the legal industry. We do know that generic sort of pledges to increase diversity and inclusion in the year have not worked for nearly 30 years. From our research, the first industry-wide pledge we could find was in 1992, and we really have not made progress with any demographic group in leadership in the legal industry that you would expect from such loud pledges and initiatives. And we also know that one-off requests by clients have made a difference on their teams, which is great, super important, because if one law firm is listening to one client, then we are making a difference. But we still have not seen movement within the industry as a whole, and so we're hoping that this collective effort will do that. And as Valerie started out, we're a lab. Everything we do is an experiment, and we'll be reporting back to the industry on sort of what's working and what's not, and how the Diversity Dividends Collective is playing out. And we're also will be reporting out effectiveness of the Mansfield for legal departments in the next few months as well. So if you'd like to stay in touch, please reach out to me or Valerie. Valerie, would you mind putting, I'll put my email address in the chat, and you can put yours. But we are always accessible. We'd love to talk with you. Maybe you're just shy and don't want to ask questions in front of the group.
I'm going to open up a question to the group, which is we have a lot of pretty seasoned legal ops professionals on the call, and I'm curious, after sort of hearing this dialogue and discussion, thinking about some of the things that you have done that have maybe been successful or not so successful, does it kind of spark any new or interesting ideas? Does it kind of wrap into any lessons that you've maybe learned, or if you have anything you want to share about things that you have found to be effective? Any comments from the group on that?
Good question.
I mean, I would say, so for myself, I was really interested in all of the very micro level comments because I've always been feeling like thinking, or not always, but for many years been thinking I really need to collect timekeeper data at that level, because without that, I can't do anything. I can't make a business case. I can't have a meaningful discussion. I can't talk to outside counsel. I can't talk to my in-house leadership and lawyers, but really those resonated with me a lot and got me thinking, well, there's a lot of really good reasons not to do it. Some, more philosophical, and some just very practical and tactical. So it actually is making me rethink the approach that we should take, certainly in my organization.
Yeah, it's almost, I've seen this with a lot of legal departments. It's this hesitancy to start someplace, and this is such a lawyer thing, right, too, but and then the goal of getting it perfect right out the gates. That's a nice thing about kind of what we do at Diversity Lab, is we know nothing's going to be perfect out of the gates, so we just try and take one step. But it's interesting that you've thought about, like, well, we have to get this timekeeper level data. And I think for many legal departments it is useful. It depends on your resources that you have internally and how you're using the data. But we certainly don't think it's necessary to have an effective DEI program when partnering with outside counsel firms. Kevin, really great question. We have not dived into the global space at Diversity Lab. What we've seen, so we have a few legal departments who are involved in the Mansfield rule for legal departments, who are sort of piloting global implementation. Now, that's primarily when thinking about their internal hires or hires for internal positions. What's interesting is our two primary legal departments that are piloting it have implemented it in very different ways. So one legal department, they're a large consulting firm, and they, of course, went deep in trying to get it perfect, to our earlier point, Nikki, out the gates. And they've created customized sort of metrics for every region within the world based on underrepresented populations. And I don't think that they're meeting all of the Mansfield rule requirements when it comes to those metrics globally, but they're not required to for certification. They're just doing this because they wanted to, which is great. And then we have another organization. They're really a truly global organization. Their legal department isn't even housed anywhere, right? They're all over the world. And so the approach that they've taken is they came up with sort of a generic question as to include in all application materials. And I think that they're asking this of outside counsel too. And they've just asked, do you identify as an underrepresented population in your country, state, or region? So I think it's a really nice, simple approach to understanding and sort of getting at the goal of those consideration pools. But certainly, if you're implementing this globally, the underrepresented populations will be different everywhere, depending on where you're talking about it. The metrics will certainly be different. So when we look at the metrics goals that we set at Diversity Lab, and we only set those really in relation to the inclusion blueprint, which Valerie mentioned briefly, but we, like I said, everything we do is grounded in data. So we look at who's coming out of law schools, and we look at where AmLaw 200 firms are now. And we set goals that are achievable, but still a stretch for where they are now. So I think that the only way to actually have an effective program is to do that sort of upfront data analysis in your region or in the country where you are, to make sure that any goals that you're setting match with who's coming out of law school or whatever the schooling is required for whatever position you're looking at and where the current stats are. It's also why when we talk about the populations that we're trying to impact with our work, we use the term underrepresented populations, because we know from data that the specific populations that we're looking at are underrepresented. And what's super interesting about that is we're starting to see in the legal industry that its potential, which is not really locked in and it's only been a year or two, but when we look at Asian American Pacific Islander lawyers, they are actually starting to match in the equity partnership level at Law 200 firms are starting to match demographic data within the US. So we might come to a place where that it no longer makes sense to think of those lawyers as underrepresented, but we're not there yet. But I think really taking a deep dive into the data in wherever you want to implement your programming is important. And your goals and your metrics will be different. I cannot answer a question simply. I'm sorry, I just ramble on and on. So apologies for that.
Great answer, thank you.
Other comments or questions, thoughts? Okay, well, I can close the meeting.
Okay.
Thank you both so much. I think this was great discussion. I expect you'll probably get some offline follow-ups from folks who joined. For me, it was really interesting and engaging, and we really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. And yes, please feel free to reach out. We're happy to have a one-on-one conversation with anyone. Always.
And Nikki, can I just say one thing? This is
Sure,
Diana.
of
No,
course.
it's not coming through. I'm on a phone and on screen. I'm just having trouble. So I just want to tell people, I've worked with these people for years. It seems like forever, but that's okay.
In a good way, right, Diana? Forever in a good way.
Yeah, in a good way. In a good way. There's been bumps and downs, and and again, I can't emphasize enough. Don't look to be perfect. Starting is in the right direction. Starting is a right step to start with. Any awareness that you can put in within your teams, and just getting that awareness out there is better than just sitting back and saying, well, I got to wait till I can be able to do these 5 things or whatever, because we're never going to get there, and it's constantly changing. So that's my 2 cents for people.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. All right, well, everyone have a great rest of your day. Thank you again, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Great to meet everyone.